If you can play Chopin, I'll marry you, said CEO Kenneth Sterling with a smirk to Lila Washington, a quiet black woman who worked as a cleaner, sparking an unexpected journey. Their paths, bound by music and hidden pasts, weave a tale of healing and heart. Before diving in, share where you're from and rate this heartfelt journey from 0 to 10 at the end. Enjoy. The lobby of Apex Dynamics shimmered under the glow of crystal pendant lights, its marble floors reflecting the ambition that pulsed through the corporate heart of the city. It was late, past 9, and the usual hum of executives and assistants had faded to a whisper. Only the faint squeak of a mop and the distant hum of a vacuum cleaner broke the silence. Kenneth Sterling, the blonde, blue-eyed CEO, strode through the atrium, his tailored navy suit crisp despite the long day. His phone glowed in his hand, emails stacking like bricks in an endless wall. He barely noticed the world beyond the screen, until his gaze caught on the grand piano, a polished relic at the center of the glass and steel space, its black lacquer gleaming like a forgotten promise. He stopped, his polished loafers clicking sharply against the floor. A woman, dressed in the unassuming gray uniform of the cleaning staff, was scrubbing the marble near the piano's legs. Her movements were deliberate, almost reverent, as if the act of cleaning were a ritual rather than a chore. Kenneth didn't know her name, though he'd seen her before, a quiet presence in the late-night shadows of his empire. Something about her stillness, the way her hands moved with precision, tugged at a corner of his mind he rarely visited. He smirked, the kind of half-thought gesture that came too easily after years of commanding boardrooms. "If you can play Chopin's Nocturne in C minor, I'll marry you on the spot," he said, his voice carrying a playful edge that masked the arrogance beneath. He didn't look up from his phone as he spoke, the words tossed like a coin into a fountain, careless, expecting no ripple. The woman paused, her mop stilling in her hands. Kenneth glanced at her, expecting a shy smile or a nervous laugh, the kind of response he was used to from those who orbited his world. She didn't laugh. Lila Washington, a black woman in her late 30s, stood slowly, her dark eyes meeting his with a clarity that made the air feel heavier. Her face was unreadable, not defiant but steady, as if she'd heard such challenges before and found them wanting. Her hair, pulled back in a neat bun, caught the light, and her hands, calloused from years of labor, rested lightly on the mop handle. The piano loomed beside her, its presence almost palpable, like a third person in the room. "I heard you," Lila said, her voice low, measured, carrying a weight that made Kenneth's smirk falter. "But that's not a piece you play for a dare." Her words were soft but sharp, slicing through the casual bravado of his challenge. She didn't wait for a reply, returning to her work with the same deliberate care as if the piano were a sacred artifact, and she its silent guardian. Kenneth raised an eyebrow, caught off guard. He wasn't used to being dismissed, certainly not by someone whose name he hadn't bothered to learn until the badge on her uniform caught his eye. Lila Washington. The name felt like it belonged to someone else, someone who didn't spend her nights polishing the floors of his kingdom. He studied her for a moment longer, the way her hands moved, the way her gaze lingered on the piano, not as an object to be cleaned, but as something remembered, something loved. "Didn't think so," he said, his tone lighter now, but the words felt hollow even to him. He turned toward the elevator, swiping his badge with a practiced flick of his wrist. The doors slid open, and he stepped inside, the mirrored interior reflecting his sharp features and the faint crease of unease on his brow. As the elevator ascended, the lobby faded from view, but the image of Lila lingered, her stillness, her words, the way she'd looked at the piano like it held secrets she wasn't ready to share. Below, Lila waited until the elevator's hum faded, until the lobby was hers again. She set the mop against her cart and approached the piano, her steps slow, deliberate. The air felt different now, charged with the echo of Kenneth's challenge. She slid onto the bench, the wood cool beneath her, and let her fingers hover over the keys. They didn't touch, didn't press, just lingered, as if tracing the outline of a memory. Her eyes closed, and the silence around her seemed to hum, alive with notes she hadn't played in years. She saw flashes, calloused fingers on ivory keys, a small stage lit by a single spotlight, the weight of a crowd's expectation, the warmth of a hand that wasn't there anymore. The memories pressed against her chest, heavy, but not unwelcome. She exhaled, her breath steady, and opened her eyes. The piano stared back, patient, waiting. But Lila didn't play. She stood, adjusted her cart, and moved on, her footsteps soft against the marble. The piano remained silent, but its presence followed her, a quiet promise that some things, once loved, never truly leave. Kenneth, now in his penthouse office, leaned back in his chair, the city skyline sprawling beyond the glass. His phone lay forgotten on the desk, the emails unanswered. He couldn't shake the moment in the lobby, the way Lila had looked at him, not with awe or fear, but with something else, something that felt like truth. He'd built an empire on control, on knowing every variable, every outcome. Yet, here was a woman who, in a single sentence, had unraveled that certainty. He didn't know why he'd said it, that reckless challenge about Chopin. Maybe it was the monotony of another late night, the weight of a company that demanded everything, but gave nothing back. Maybe it was the piano itself, gleaming under the lights, a relic of a life he'd left behind. Or maybe it was Lila, her quiet strength a mirror to something he'd forgotten how to feel. Whatever it was, the moment had passed, but it left a crack in the polished surface of his world. Lila, meanwhile, pushed her cart down the empty hallway, the faint scent of lemon cleaner trailing behind her. She didn't think of Kenneth's words, not really. They were just noise, the kind of thing people with power said to fill the silence. But the piano, that was different. It wasn't just wood and wire. It was a doorway to a life she'd locked away, a life where music wasn't a job or a dare, but a language for everything she couldn't say. As she locked the supply closet and prepared to leave, she glanced back at the lobby. The piano stood alone, its surface catching the light, like a quiet challenge of its own. Lila's lips curved, not quite a smile, but something close. She turned off the lights, and the atrium fell into shadow, the piano a silhouette against the glass. Tomorrow, it would still be there, waiting. And so would she. The Apex Dynamics lobby was a different beast at night, its grandeur softened by the dimmed pendant lights that cast long, golden shadows across the marble. Kenneth Sterling, still in his tailored suit, lingered longer than usual, his footsteps echoing as he paced the atrium. The city beyond the glass walls glittered, but his mind was tethered to the previous night. Lila Washington's steady gaze, her quiet rebuke that Chopin wasn't a dare. Her words had lodged in him like a splinter, sharp and impossible to ignore. He'd spent the day distracted, his boardroom decisiveness dulled by the memory of her hands, not scrubbing, but hovering, as if the piano held a piece of her soul. He didn't know why he was back here, not really. The reports on his desk, the investor calls, the looming gala, they all demanded his attention. Yet here he was, circling the grand piano like a man searching for something he couldn't name. The cleaning crew had come and gone, but the faint scent of lemon polish lingered. And there, at the far end of the lobby, was Lila. She knelt beside the piano, her cloth gliding over the brass pedals, with a care that seemed to belong to a craftsman, not a cleaner. The sight of her, so composed, so deliberate, stirred something in Kenneth, a restlessness, a flicker of shame. He cleared his throat, the sound sharper than intended in the quiet. Lila didn't flinch, her movements unbroken, but her eyes flicked up, dark and unreadable, meeting his across the expanse of marble. Kenneth shoved his hands into his pockets, suddenly aware of how out of place he felt in his own domain. "I owe you an apology, Lila," he said, his voice low but firm, carrying the weight of a man unused to admitting fault. "That Chopin comment last night, it was out of line." Lila paused, her cloth stilling against the pedal. She stood slowly, folding the cloth with precision, as if each crease were a decision. "For what?" she asked, her tone neutral but piercing, like a note held just long enough to demand attention. "For being condescending," Kenneth said, stepping closer, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. "It was a stupid thing to say, and I didn't mean it the way it came out." He meant it, or thought he did, but the words felt clumsy, inadequate against the clarity in her gaze. Lila tilted her head, studying him. Her uniform was crisp, her posture straight, but there was something in her presence, a quiet authority that made the vast lobby feel smaller. "Most people don't know Chopin's not a parlor trick," she said, her voice soft but steady, like a melody played pianissimo. "It's prayer set to music. You don't play it to win bets." Kenneth's brow furrowed, caught off guard by the depth in her words. He'd expected deference, maybe a quick acceptance of his apology, but not this. This insight that felt like it came from someone who'd lived inside the music, not just cleaned around it. "You talk like someone who's played it," he said, his voice quieter now, probing. Lila's lips curved. Not quite a smile, but something cryptic, a shadow of a memory. "I've played a lot of things," she said, her eyes drifting to the piano, its black lacquer reflecting the faint glow of the lights. "Doesn't mean I still do." "Why not?" Kenneth asked the question, slipping out before he could stop it. He leaned against the piano, the wood cool under his palm, and realized he was genuinely curious about her, about the life she carried behind those steady eyes. Lila didn't answer right away. She set the cloth on her cart, her movements deliberate, as if weighing whether to let him in. "Because some things stop belonging to you when you stop needing them to survive," she said, finally, her voice barely above a whisper, but heavy with truth. The words landed like a chord, resonant and unresolved, stirring something in Kenneth he hadn't felt in years. A pang of recognition, a memory of the boy who'd once played piano not for applause, but for joy. He nodded, unsure how to respond. The silence between them wasn't awkward, but dense, like the pause before a crescendo. "Good night, Mr. Sterling," Lila said, turning to her cart, her tone polite but final, as if closing a door she wasn't ready to open further. "Wait," Kenneth called, his voice sharper than he meant. She stopped, one hand on the cart, and looked back, her expression unreadable. He took a breath, steadying himself. "Next time I say something reckless, call me out. Don't let me get away with it." Lila's eyes softened, a flicker of amusement breaking through her calm. "Do you say reckless things often?" she asked, her tone almost playful, like a musician testing a new rhythm. Kenneth hesitated, then let out a small, self-deprecating laugh. "Only when I feel something I don't understand," he admitted, the honesty surprising him. It was true. He'd built his life on control, on calculated moves, but last night's challenge had been impulsive, a crack in his carefully constructed facade. And Lila, with her quiet strength, had widened that crack. Her gaze held his for a moment longer. Something unspoken passing between them. A spark. Not of romance, but of recognition. Two people seeing each other beyond their roles. "You understood more than you think," she said softly. "You just didn't know how to say it." She turned back to her cart, pushing it toward the hallway, her footsteps steady against the marble. Kenneth watched her go, the lobby suddenly too large, too quiet. He lingered by the piano, his fingers brushing the edge of the bench where Lila had sat the night before. The instrument felt alive, as if it held the echo of her presence, her words. He didn't know why they mattered so much, why this woman, this moment, felt like a key turning in a lock he'd forgotten he owned. As Lila disappeared into the shadows of the hallway, she didn't look back. The piano stood silent, but its presence followed her, a reminder of a life she'd left behind, a life of stages and spotlights, of music that had once been her breath. She didn't play anymore, not for dares, not for anyone. But tonight, for the first time in years, she felt the pull of the keys, the faint hum of a melody she hadn't dared to touch since her world had changed. Kenneth, alone now, walked to the elevator, the city's skyline a blur beyond the glass. He swiped his badge, the doors closing with a soft hiss. As the elevator climbed, he realized he was humming, a faint, halting fragment of Chopin's Nocturne, the notes clumsy but persistent. The sound startled him, a ghost from a life he'd buried under ambition. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew one thing. Lila Washington wasn't just a cleaner, and he wasn't sure he was just a CEO anymore either. The Apex Dynamics Gala was a spectacle of glittering excess, a chandelier-lit ballroom filled with the city's elite, executives in tailored tuxedos, artists draped in silk, and investors whose smiles masked their calculations. Kenneth Sterling stood at the edge of the room, a glass of untouched champagne in hand, his blonde hair catching the light like a halo he didn't deserve. The weight of Lila Washington's words from the previous night clung to him, her quiet assertion that music was prayer, not a parlor trick, echoing in his mind. He'd tried to shake it, burying himself in meetings and emails, but the memory of her steady gaze lingered, a note that refused to resolve. Tonight, though, was about control, about reinforcing his place at the helm of Apex. Or so he thought. The evening's centerpiece was to be a performance by a renowned pianist, a star from the Vienna Conservatory, meant to open the gala with Bach's Prelude in C major, a nod to the company's cultured image. But as Kenneth mingled, nodding through small talk, his assistant, Clara, rushed to his side, her face pale. "The pianist was in a car accident," she whispered, her voice tight. "He's in the hospital. The board's panicking." Kenneth's jaw tightened, his mind racing. The gala was a high-stakes showcase, a chance to secure a multi-million-dollar deal with a key investor. A missing performer could unravel it all. The board, a cluster of gray-haired men and women with eyes like hawks, cornered him near the stage. "You trained as a pianist, didn't you, Sterling?" asked Evelyn Hart, the board's sharp-tongued chairwoman, her tone half joking, half demanding. "Surely you can fill in for a few minutes. Something simple. Bach, perhaps?" The others nodded, their smiles thin, expectant. Kenneth's chest tightened. He hadn't touched a piano in 18 years, not since his father's voice, cold, cutting, had branded failure into his bones. "You'll never be worth hearing if you miss a single note." Pride, that relentless god, surged in his veins. He couldn't refuse, not in front of them, not when his empire hung in the balance. "Fine," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I'll do it." Clara handed him the sheet music, her eyes wide with worry, but he waved it away. He knew the prelude, or thought he did. As he climbed the stage, the spotlight burned against his skin, the crowd's murmur fading to a suffocating hush. The grand piano gleamed, its keys a gauntlet of memory and expectation. Kenneth sat, his fingers hovering, and for a moment he was 16 again, practicing until his hands ached, chasing a perfection his father never acknowledged. The first notes were tentative, clumsy, like a language half forgotten. He pushed through, his tempo faltering, the melody blurring as his left hand froze, paralyzed by a memory he couldn't name. The notes bled together, a discordant stumble that echoed his father's disdain. The crowd clapped politely, but their confusion was palpable. Whispers rippled through the room, eyes darting, questioning. Why is he up there? Was that intentional? Kenneth stood, his face a mask of composure, but his palms throbbed with the ghost of the final chord. He slipped backstage, the velvet curtain a shield against the pity in their gazes. He didn't want their sympathy. He wanted air. The backstage area was a maze of shadows, crates, and forgotten props. Kenneth leaned against a wall, his breath shallow, the weight of his failure heavier than the applause. Then he heard it. Music, soft but precise, a breath of clarity cutting through the chaos. It was Bach, the same prelude, but this time alive, each note a heartbeat, each pause a prayer. He followed the sound, his pulse quickening, until he reached a dimly lit storage bay. There, at a weathered upright piano, sat Lila Washington. Her fingers danced across the keys with a grace that seemed to belong to another world. Her eyes half closed, her posture speaking of old discipline. The music wasn't just played, it was lived, as if she and the piano were one, the notes an extension of her soul. Kenneth stood frozen, the chill of the concrete floor forgotten. It wasn't just that she was good, it was that she played like the music knew her, like she'd carried it through years of silence and loss. The final chord faded, and Lila glanced up, unsurprised to see him. "Thought you left?" she said softly, her voice a quiet anchor in the dim light. "I did," Kenneth whispered, his throat tight. "But then you played." Lila stood, brushing imaginary dust from her uniform, her movements calm but deliberate. "You rushed the middle," she said, her tone matter-of-fact but not unkind. "Too much tension in your shoulders." Kenneth's lips twitched, a mix of defensiveness and awe. "You were listening. You were shouting, Mr. Sterling," she replied, her eyes meeting his with that same clarity that had undone him the night before. "Not playing." The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. He stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking. "How do you know the piece?" he asked, his voice low, searching. Lila's gaze drifted to the piano, her fingers brushing its edge. "I played it once," she said, her voice distant. "For someone who mattered." A beat of silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken stories. Kenneth crossed his arms, his suit jacket pulling tight. "You're not just a cleaner, are you?" The question wasn't accusatory, but urgent, as if her answer could unravel the knot in his chest. Lila's lips curved, that cryptic, almost smile returning. "No more than you're just a CEO," she said. "We all wear uniforms." Her words hung in the air, a challenge and an invitation, as she turned back to the piano, her fingers lingering on the keys one last time before she stepped away. Kenneth watched her, the music still echoing in his mind, a melody that felt like a door creaking open. He didn't know who she was, not yet, but he knew she was no stranger to the piano, to the weight of notes that carried more than sound. As Lila gathered her cleaning supplies and disappeared into the shadows, Kenneth stood alone, the gala's noise a distant hum. The piano in the storage bay, old and worn, seemed to hum with her presence, a reminder that some truths couldn't be polished away. The morning after the gala, the Apex Dynamics headquarters buzzed with whispers, the air thick with the residue of Kenneth Sterling's faltering performance. He sat in his penthouse office, the city skyline a gray blur beyond the glass, his mind not on the contracts piling up, but on Lila Washington's flawless Bach, played in a shadowed storage bay. Her words, "No more than you're just a CEO," had burrowed into him, a challenge that refused to fade. Who was she? This woman who cleaned floors, yet played like she'd once owned stages. The question gnawed at him, pulling him from his usual orbit of control and calculation. Kenneth's fingers danced across his keyboard, not signing deals, but diving into a digital labyrinth of old concert archives, music blogs, and faded press clippings. He wasn't sure what he was looking for until he found it. A grainy photo from a 2005 Harmony showcase, a young black woman at a piano, her posture regal, her eyes fierce with focus. The caption read, "L. Washington, a finalist, poised to redefine classical performance." Another article, dated 2008, called her a rising star. Her interpretations of Bach and Chopin, breathtaking, soul-deep. Then, in 2009, nothing. She vanished from the circuit, no scandals, no farewell tours, just silence. Kenneth leaned back, his pulse quickening. Lila Washington wasn't just a cleaner. She was a fallen star, hidden in plain sight. That evening, he found her in the executive break room, scrubbing a stainless steel sink with the same care she'd given the piano's pedals. The room was sterile, all chrome and glass, a stark contrast to the warmth in her movements. Kenneth closed the door behind him, the click loud in the quiet. "You're L. Washington," he said, his voice low, steady, but carrying the weight of discovery. Finalist at the Harmony Showcase, a name people thought would be a legend. "Why are you here? Cleaning my floors?" Lila didn't flinch, her hands steady as she rinsed her cloth under the faucet. She turned, drying her hands on a towel, her dark eyes meeting his without surprise, as if she'd been waiting for this moment. "You've done your homework," she said, her tone calm but edged with something unreadable. Resignation, perhaps, or defiance. "I don't like mysteries in my building," Kenneth replied, stepping closer, his blonde hair catching the fluorescent light. He crossed his arms, not to intimidate but to anchor himself. "You were a prodigy. Critics said you'd redefine the genre. Then you disappeared in 2009. No trace. And now you're here, pushing a mop in the same hallways where artists who couldn't match your talent get standing ovations." Lila set the cloth down, her movements deliberate, as if handling something fragile. "I'm not a mystery, Mr. Sterling," she said, leaning against the counter, her posture relaxed but her gaze piercing. "I'm a woman doing her job." "No," Kenneth said, his voice sharper now, urgent. "You're hiding. I want to know why." He wasn't sure why it mattered so much, why her story felt like a key to something he'd locked away in himself. Maybe it was the way her playing had stirred memories of his own abandoned music, or the way her quiet strength mirrored a vulnerability he'd buried under ambition. Lila sighed, a soft sound that carried years of weight. She crossed her arms loosely, her eyes drifting to the window, where the city's lights flickered like distant stars. "You ever lose everything that made sense in one moment?" she asked, her voice low, almost a whisper. "You train your whole life for something, music in my case. You breathe it, bleed it, let it carve you into someone new. Then life hands you a new score, written in a key you've never seen." Kenneth's throat tightened, her words echoing the ache he'd felt on that gala stage, his fingers faltering under his father's shadow. "What was the moment?" he asked, his voice softer now, almost reverent. Lila hesitated, her gaze distant, as if peering into a past she rarely visited. "My husband," she said finally, her voice steady but heavy with quiet finality. "Cancer. He passed in the spring of 2009. Our daughter, Amara, was 2. I couldn't tour with a toddler, couldn't teach masterclasses, and still be there when she woke up crying in the night. I had to choose." The air in the break room felt heavier, sacred, like a chapel after a hymn. Kenneth swallowed, his usual confidence unraveling. "You chose her," he said, not a question but a recognition. "I gave up the stage," Lila corrected, her eyes meeting his again, clear and unflinching. "Not the music." The distinction landed like a chord. resonant and true. She didn't play for fame or applause anymore, but the music was still there, woven into her bones, her breath. Kenneth leaned against the counter across from her, the distance between them shrinking. "I don't know if I'd be strong enough to do that," he admitted, the words slipping out before he could stop them. He thought of his own sacrifices, nights spent building Apex, dreams of music traded for power, but they felt hollow compared to hers. "You'd be surprised what you're capable of when someone small needs you to survive," Lila said, her voice softening, a flicker of warmth breaking through her reserve. She picked up the cloth again, folding it with care, as if signaling the conversation's end. Kenneth didn't move. "Where is it now?" he asked. "The music." Lila's eyes flicked to him, then away, a shadow of a smile crossing her lips. "It's quiet," she said. "Sometimes it wakes up when Amara laughs or when she sleeps. But I don't play anymore. Not like I used to." "Why not?" he pressed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because when I sit at the keys now," she said, her voice steady but raw, "I hear everything I've lost." The confession hung between them, a note sustained too long, waiting for resolution. Kenneth felt it in his chest, a mirror to his own silence, the piano he'd abandoned after his father's voice had carved failure into him. He nodded, the weight of her words settling into him. "You're wrong," he said quietly, surprising himself. "You don't hear what you've lost. You hear who you've loved. That's not the same thing." Lila studied him, her expression unreadable. But something shifted, a softening, a crack in the wall she'd built. "You sound like someone who's been there," she said, her voice almost a challenge. "I was 12, Kenneth said, the memory spilling out unbidden. "My father was a conductor, brilliant but brutal. Music was his god, and I was never good enough. One night I missed a note. He told me not to touch the piano again until I was worth hearing. I never played after that." Lila's jaw tightened, a flicker of anger in her eyes, not at him, but at the man who'd silenced him. "You still believe him?" she asked. "I don't know," Kenneth admitted, his voice raw. "But I still hear him," she nodded, a shared understanding passing between them. "Then maybe we're both missing the same thing," she said, "playing for someone who doesn't know who we were." Kenneth didn't respond. The truth of her words was too heavy to touch. Lila turned, gathering her supplies, and left the break room, her footsteps soft but resolute. Kenneth stood alone, the sink gleaming under the fluorescent light, the city's hum a distant pulse. He didn't know what came next, but he knew one thing. Lila Washington wasn't just a cleaner, and the music she carried was far from silent. The Apex Dynamics lobby was a cathedral of glass and silence after midnight, the pendant lights casting a soft glow over the grand piano, its black lacquer a mirror to the city's restless pulse. Kenneth Sterling lingered in the atrium, his tie loosened, his blonde hair slightly mussed from a day that refused to end. The break room conversation with Lila Washington had left him unmoored, her confession about abandoning her stage career for her daughter, Amara, echoing his own buried memories of music silenced by his father's cruelty. Her words, "You don't hear what you've lost, you hear who you've loved," had cracked something open in him, a longing he hadn't touched in years. He didn't know why he was here, standing by the piano, but the pull was undeniable, like a melody half remembered. He sat at the bench, the wood cool under his palms, and let his fingers hover over the keys. The notes came haltingly, a clumsy attempt at a piece he'd once known, Schubert's Impromptu in G-flat major, soft and searching. Each note felt like a confession, raw and unsteady, his hands betraying the years of rust. He played as if testing a language he'd forgotten, the music stumbling but earnest, a plea to reclaim something lost. The lobby, swallowed the sound, its vastness amplifying his vulnerability. A soft creak broke the silence. Lila's cleaning cart, pausing at the edge of the atrium. Kenneth froze, his fingers stalling mid-phrase, but he didn't turn. He sensed her presence, steady and unintrusive, like a shadow that didn't demand attention. "Keep going," she said, her voice low, a quiet encouragement that carried no judgment. Kenneth's shoulders tensed, the weight of her gaze both unnerving and anchoring. He resumed, the notes faltering but persistent, until a second pair of hands joined his. Lila slid onto the bench beside him, her movements fluid, unhurried. Her fingers found the keys with a grace that belied her gray uniform, weaving a harmony that caught his faltering melody like a lifeline. Their hands moved together, not perfectly, but truthfully, creating a patchwork piece, half Schubert, half something new, born in the moment. Her notes were soft but sure, lifting his where they stumbled, building a dialogue that felt like breathing. Their fingers brushed once, twice, a fleeting connection that sent a jolt through Kenneth's chest. He didn't look at her, didn't need to. The music spoke for them, a language beyond the roles they wore: CEO, cleaner, prodigy, failure. The final notes faded, leaving a silence that felt alive, humming with the weight of what they'd created. Kenneth's hands lingered on the keys, his breath uneven. Lila sat still, her posture calm but her eyes bright, reflecting the pendant lights like stars. "Your left hand tenses when you're uncertain," she said, her voice soft but precise, like a teacher correcting a student with care. Kenneth exhaled, a half laugh escaping him. "So does my heart," he admitted, the words slipping out before he could stop them. He turned to her, his blue eyes searching her face, finding no trace of the deference he was used to. Instead, there was understanding, a shared vulnerability that made the vast lobby feel intimate. "The two are connected," Lila said, her lips curving into that cryptic, almost smile. She glanced at the piano, her fingers brushing the keys one last time, as if sealing a promise. "What was that piece?" Kenneth asked, his voice low, almost afraid to break the spell. "We made it up," Lila replied, her eyes meeting his. "It's not Schubert anymore, it's ours." The word, ours, hung between them, heavy with possibility. She stood, smoothing her uniform but didn't step away, her presence anchoring the moment. Kenneth leaned back, his hands still resting on the bench. "We should finish it someday," he said, echoing her words from the break room, but this time they felt like a vow. Lila nodded, her gaze steady. "Maybe we already started," she said, her voice soft but resonant, like a note that lingers after the key is released. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was dense, filled with the echo of their duet, the unspoken stories they'd woven into the music. Kenneth felt it in his chest, a stirring he hadn't known since he was a boy, playing for the sheer joy of it, before his father's voice had turned music into a battlefield. Lila, too, felt the pull of the keys, a reminder of the stages she'd left behind, the music she'd buried to keep Amara safe. But tonight, for the first time in years, that music felt alive again, not as a performance but as a connection. Lila stepped back, her cart waiting in the shadows. "Good night, Mr. Sterling," she said, her tone polite but warm, a door left slightly ajar. She pushed the cart toward the hallway, her footsteps soft against the marble, leaving the piano to its silence. Kenneth remained at the bench, his fingers tracing the keys where hers had been. The lobby felt different now, no longer a monument to his ambition, but a space where something real had taken root. He didn't know what it meant. Not yet. But he knew he couldn't go back to the man he'd been yesterday, the one who'd tossed careless challenges and buried his own music under layers of control. As he stood, the city's lights flickered beyond the glass, a reminder of the world waiting outside. But for the first time, that world felt less urgent, less defining. He glanced at the hallway where Lila had disappeared, her presence lingering like a melody he couldn't shake. The piano stood silent, but its keys seemed to hum, waiting for the next note, the next moment when their hands might meet again. The Apex Dynamics lobby, once a sanctuary of their midnight duet, now felt like a stage under harsh scrutiny. Kenneth Sterling stood in his penthouse office, the city's skyline, a cold mosaic beyond the glass, his phone vibrating with notifications that refused to relent. The impromptu melody he and Lila Washington had woven at the grand piano, a raw, fleeting moment of connection, had been captured by a security camera, its grainy footage leaking into the digital ether. By morning, the 38-second clip had exploded across internal Slack channels, social media, and even Reddit, amassing over 200,000 views. The caption read, "When the CEO plays a duet with the cleaner, the piano remembers." Below it, a crueler jab. Romance or power play? Kenneth's jaw clenched as he watched the video, their hands moving in sync, their eyes meeting briefly. The intimacy undeniable despite the shaky zoom. The whispers had started before he'd even reached his desk. Assistants averted their eyes, executives exchanged glances in the elevator, and Clara, his assistant, hovered nervously by his door. "It's everywhere," she said, her voice tight. "The board's been calling. Evelyn Hart wants a meeting at 4. They're saying it's a PR crisis. Optics, power dynamics, you know how it goes." Kenneth nodded, his face a mask of calm, but his pulse thrummed with unease. He'd built Apex on precision, every move calculated. Yet this moment, unscripted, human, threatened to unravel it all. He found Lila in the staff stairwell, wiping down handrails with the same deliberate care she'd given the piano. The fluorescent light cast stark shadows, but her presence softened the space, her gray uniform a quiet defiance against the storm brewing above. Kenneth held up his phone, the frozen frame of their duet glowing on the screen. "It's everywhere," he said, his voice low, edged with frustration. "They're turning this into something it's not." Lila didn't pause, her cloth gliding along the rail. "I know," she said, her tone calm, as if the world's eyes on their shared moment were just another task to handle. "Payroll guy winked at me this morning, called me maestro. Thought he was joking until I saw the comments." Kenneth stepped closer, his polished shoes scuffing the concrete steps. "This isn't funny," he said, his voice sharper than intended. "They're saying I'm using you, or you're using me, or I'm chasing some midlife redemption arc to fix my image. They're questioning my judgment, my leadership." Lila stopped, folding the cloth with precision, her dark eyes meeting his. "And what do you think it is?" she asked, her voice steady but piercing, cutting through the noise of his spiraling thoughts. Kenneth blinked, caught off guard. He leaned against the wall, the cold concrete grounding him. "I think it's real," he said, his voice softening, raw with honesty. "That moment at the piano, it's the most honest thing I've felt in years. Not a game, not a strategy. Just us." Lila studied him, her expression unreadable, but not unkind. "Then why do you look like you're already running from it?" she asked, her words a quiet challenge, echoing the clarity she'd brought to their duet. Kenneth's throat tightened, her question exposing the fear he hadn't named. The fear of losing the empire he'd built, of being seen as weak, human, fallible. "Because I know how this ends," he admitted, his voice cracking. "They'll drag my name, question every decision I've made. The board, the investors. They'll tear apart everything I've built because I dared to feel something real." Lila's gaze softened, but her voice held steady. "You think I don't know what it's like to watch a life dissolve," she said, stepping closer, her presence a quiet force. "I gave up stages, spotlights, everything I was so Amara could breathe, You think I don't know what it means to lose what you love? Kenneth looked away, her words a mirror to his own buried losses. The music he'd abandoned. The boy he'd been before ambition became his armor. I didn't ask for this, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. No, Lila replied, her tone firm but not cruel. But you played for it. You showed up for it, and now you want to hide. I'm trying to protect you, he snapped, his frustration spilling over. This scrutiny, this gossip, it'll hurt you, Amara. Your life. Lila's eyes flashed, not with anger, but with truth. You're not protecting me, she said. You're protecting your image, and you're using me as the excuse to retreat. The words landed like a slap, sharp and undeniable. Kenneth flinched, but she didn't back down, her gaze holding his like a note sustained too long. Let me ask you something, she continued, her voice softer now, but no less piercing. When was the last time you stayed in something messy, something you couldn't control, couldn't schedule, couldn't win? Kenneth's mouth opened, then closed, her question cutting through the layers of his carefully constructed world. He thought of boardrooms, contracts, the calculated moves that had defined him. But messy? Real. He hadn't stayed in anything like that since he was a boy, silenced by his father's voice. That's what I thought, Lila said, reading his silence. She turned back to the handrail, resuming her work, but the air between them crackled with unspoken truths. Kenneth ran a hand through his hair, his composure fraying. You think I'll walk away, he said, his voice low, almost a plea. Is that what you see? I don't think it, Lila said, her eyes meeting his again, steady and clear. I see it. She pushed her cart toward the stairwell's exit, her footsteps soft but resolute, leaving Kenneth alone with the echo of her words. He stood there, the fluorescent hum filling the silence, his phone still glowing with the frozen image of their duet. The world outside was turning their moment into a scandal, a spectacle. But to him, it was something else, a crack in the armor he'd worn for years. Lila's challenge lingered, a dare more real than the one he'd thrown at her about Chopin. As he climbed the stairs back to his office, the city's lights blurred beyond the glass, and for the first time Kenneth wondered if he could stay in the mess, or if he'd run, just as she'd seen. The city's pulse faded to a sterile hum as Kenneth Sterling stepped into the hospital's pediatric wing, the antiseptic air sharp against his skin. The viral storm surrounding his and Lila Washington's duet had left him raw. Lila's words in the stairwell. You're protecting your image, not me, cutting deeper than the board's threats or the internet's speculation. He hadn't slept, his mind replaying their music, her challenge, the truth he couldn't outrun. A text from Lila, sent hours ago and unanswered, had led him here. Room 312. Amara's sick. No explanation, just an address and a plea buried in the brevity. Kenneth had run, his polished shoes pounding the pavement, fear eclipsing the chaos of his crumbling empire. The hallway smelled of disinfectant and dread, fluorescent lights flickering like a pulse, too weak to hold steady. Room 312's door was ajar, and Kenneth paused, his hand hovering, heart thudding. Inside, Lila sat beside a small bed, her gray uniform replaced by a simple sweater, her face hollowed by exhaustion. Amara, her 6-year-old daughter, lay pale against the sheets, oxygen tubes framing her face, a heart monitor beeping softly, too softly. Lila's hand clutched Amara's, her other hand pressed against her own lips, as if holding back a scream. Kenneth stepped inside, his presence quiet but heavy, like a note played too soon. Lila, he said, his voice low, barely a whisper. She looked up, her dark eyes rimmed with tears that hadn't fallen, raw with a fear that made the room feel smaller. How did you know? she asked, her voice cracking, a rare fracture in her steady calm. Your neighbor, Kenneth said, stepping closer, his gaze on Amara's fragile form. You didn't answer my text. He'd sent a message after their stairwell confrontation, a halting attempt to bridge the gap, but it had gone unanswered, lost in this crisis. Lila's shoulders sagged, her eyes returning to Amara. Sorry, she whispered, as if the word were an afterthought. It was a bad attack, asthma. Her oxygen dropped so fast they had to intubate her. I couldn't. Her voice broke, and she pressed her lips together, regaining control. Kenneth knelt beside the bed, his suit jacket brushing the floor. Amara's chest rose and fell in a shallow rhythm, a stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm, its worn fur a testament to countless nights of comfort. Is she awake? He asked, his voice soft, afraid to disturb the fragile balance of the room. She was, Lila said, her voice trembling. She kept asking for the song, the one we were writing together. Her eyes met his, a flicker of desperation breaking through. I promised I'd finish it, but I couldn't. Not now. Kenneth's throat tightened, the memory of their duet flooding back, their hands weaving a melody, raw and unpolished, in the lobby's quiet embrace. He took Lila's hand, her fingers cold but steady in his. Then, we'll finish it now, he said, his voice firm, a vow against the fear swallowing the room. She'll hear us. Lila's eyes searched his, a question unspoken. Can you stay in this mess? She nodded, a silent agreement, and they turned to Amara. No piano, no keys, just the two of them, tapping a gentle rhythm on the blanket, a lullaby born of hope and desperation. Kenneth began, his voice rusty but earnest, humming the melody they'd created, soft and searching. Lila joined, her voice a whisper, weaving harmony around his notes. The sky is dark, but not for long. The stars still hum while you sleep, my light. The words were simple, unfinished, but they carried a weight that filled the room, drowning out the monitor's beep. Amara's fingers twitched, a faint press against Lila's palm, and Kenneth felt it too. A spark of life, a sign she was listening. Lila's voice broke into a shaky smile. She hears, she whispered, tears brimming but not falling. She always does. They sang on, their voices blending, not perfect but true. A prayer set to music that reached beyond the wires and tubes. The room felt sacred, the sterile walls softened by their song, a fragile bridge between fear and hope. Kenneth's hand tightened around Lila's, grounding them both. And for a moment, the world outside, the gossip, the board, the empire, didn't exist. The door creaked, and a doctor entered, his expression measured but kind. Her vitals are stabilizing, he said, glancing at the monitor. The medication's helping, but this isn't sustainable. She'll need advanced treatment, a specialist team, likely in Boston. You should prepare. A few weeks, maybe less, if another episode hits. Lila's face tightened, her hand still clutching Amara's. I can't afford Boston, she said, her voice barely audible, raw with the weight of impossibility. I can't even afford another ER visit. Kenneth stood, his jaw set. Then let me help, he said, his voice steady, cutting through her protest before it could form. I'm not asking, I'm offering. Lila's eyes flashed, a mix of pride and pain. Do you know what it feels like to have your dignity measured in bills? She asked, her voice low, fierce. Kenneth met her gaze, unflinching. Do you know what it feels like to have money and still feel useless? He said, his voice raw, exposing a truth he'd never spoken. I've made million-dollar decisions in boardrooms while my soul begged for something real. Don't take this chance from me. A beat of silence stretched, heavy with their shared vulnerability. Then Lila nodded, tears spilling over, and Kenneth pulled her into a fierce, silent embrace. Not romantic, but human. Two people clinging to each other at the edge of fear. The monitor's steady beep filled the quiet, a reminder of Amara's fight, their fight. As they parted, Lila wiped her eyes, her composure returning. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft but resolute. Kenneth nodded, his heart pounding with purpose, a feeling he hadn't known in years. He looked at Amara, her small form a quiet call to action, and knew this moment would change everything, not just for her, but for him. The hospital's sterile hush had faded, replaced by the soft hum of spring as Kenneth Sterling stood outside the Lincoln Chapel, a tucked-away sanctuary at the city's edge, its stone walls weathered but warm under blooming dogwood trees. The memory of Room 312, Lila Washington's tear-streaked face, Amara's fragile hand twitching to their lullaby, still clung to him, a melody of hope forged in fear. The viral storm had cost him his CEO title, the board's mutual transition, a polite exile after he refused to deny the truth of his connection with Lila. But standing here, with the chapel's wooden doors ajar, Kenneth felt not loss, but purpose. A clarity he hadn't known in years. Inside, the air buzzed with anticipation, not from critics or elites, but from ordinary souls. Nurses who'd held Amara's hand, janitors who'd shared coffee with Lila, teachers and parents drawn by the story of a duet that had set the internet ablaze. Kenneth had funded the chapel's reopening through a quiet donation, a gesture not of charity, but of belief in what music could do. Lila had agreed to perform tonight, not for fame, but for Amara, now recovering in Boston after a successful surgery, her small heart stronger with each passing day. The stage held a single grand piano, its surface gleaming under a halo of warm light, a beacon in the modest hall. Kenneth found Lila backstage, her simple black dress a stark contrast to her usual uniform, her dark eyes steady but bright with nervous energy. "You ready?" he asked, his voice soft, his blonde hair catching the dim glow of a backstage bulb. Lila adjusted a hairpin, her fingers steady despite the weight of the moment. "I haven't played for an audience in years," she said, her voice low, a mix of resolve and vulnerability. "But Amara asked to hear it. She's watching." She nodded toward a tablet propped on a chair, Amara's face beaming through a video call, her smile a quiet badge of courage. Kenneth's chest tightened, the memory of their hospital lullaby anchoring him. "Then let's play for her," he said, his hand brushing hers, a fleeting touch that carried the weight of their shared journey. Lila nodded, her lips curving into a faint smile, and they stepped toward the stage. The crowd hushed as Lila sat at the piano, her posture regal, a queen returning to her throne. Kenneth stood nearby, not playing yet, his presence a silent promise of support. The first notes were gentle, hesitant, the lullaby they'd begun in the hospital now blooming into something fuller, richer. Each note carried their story. The nights Lila had chosen Amara over stages, the years Kenneth had buried his music under ambition, the moment their hands had met at the piano, weaving something new. The melody wasn't polished, but it was pure, a prayer that filled the chapel with a warmth that felt like home. Halfway through, Lila paused, her fingers trembling slightly, and looked at Kenneth. "Your turn," she whispered, her voice barely audible but resonant. He slid onto the bench beside her, their shoulders brushing, and his hands found the keys, layering a harmony that lifted her melody where it faltered. Their duet was a conversation, not of skill, but of presence. Each note a step toward healing. For Amara, for Lila, for himself. The crowd didn't applaud. They leaned forward, some weeping, some holding hands, as if afraid to disturb the holiness of the sound. Amara's face on the tablet glowed, her eyes wide, her small hands clapping softly in Boston. Lila's gaze flicked to the screen, and a tear slipped down her cheek, not from sadness, but from the truth of the moment. Kenneth felt it too. The weight of their music, a bridge across distance and pain. As the final note faded, the chapel held its breath, the silence as sacred as the song. Then, one by one, audience members placed candles at the stage's base, their flickering lights an echo of Amara's courage, Lila's sacrifice, Kenneth's awakening. Afterward, Lila and Kenneth sat on the empty stage, the crowd lingering outside, unwilling to let the magic fade. "Do you think she felt it?" Lila asked, her voice soft, her eyes on the tablet where Amara's image had been. "I think she was the one playing it through us," Kenneth said, his voice low, his hand finding hers. Lila nodded, her fingers tightening around his, a silent agreement that this moment, this music, was theirs. The weeks that followed saw the birth of the Amara Fund for Music Therapy, a foundation Kenneth and Lila co-founded, not as CEO and cleaner, but as partners in a shared mission. They brought music to underfunded hospitals, schools, and community centers, teaching children to play, to heal, to feel heard. Kenneth, free from the boardroom's chains, rediscovered his own music, not as a performance but as a gift. Lila too played again, her fingers finding melodies she'd thought lost, each one a tribute to Amara's laughter, her resilience. One evening, in a quiet Boston apartment near the hospital, they gathered with Amara, now strong enough to sit at a small keyboard. She pressed a key, giggling as it rang out, and looked at Lila. "Play the song that found me, Mama," she said, her voice bright, her scar peeking from her collar like a quiet badge of victory. Lila sat beside her, Kenneth at her side, and they played a soft, simple lullaby that carried the weight of their journey. The notes were imperfect, but they were true, a melody of forgiveness, hope, and love reborn. As Amara's fingers joined theirs, hesitant but eager, the room filled with a sound that didn't end, but echoed, a promise that some stories don't close, they ripple forever. Outside, the spring breeze carried the scent of dogwoods, clean and full of second chances. Kenneth glanced at Lila, her face lit by the soft glow of the room, and felt not the weight of his old empire, but the lightness of a life rebuilt. "We keep playing, don't we?" he asked, his voice soft, almost a whisper. Lila smiled, real and unguarded. "Always," she said, and the music hummed between them, a melody that belonged to three hearts, Amara's, Lila's, and his, bound by echoes that would never fade. We hope Echoes of Nocturne touched your heart with its melody of resilience and love. Please share your thoughts in the comments, rate this journey from 0 to 10, and let us know where you're tuning in from. Your presence means the world to us. Thank you for joining Kenneth, Lila, and Amara's story. Until the next tale, stay kind, stay brave, and keep listening for the echoes that matter.